On the 24th of February 2022, Russian soldiers invaded Ukraine after months of training exercises along the Russian border and in neighbouring Belarus. After 8 years of tension following the removal of pro-Russian President Yanukovych and the subsequent annexation of Crimea, Vladimir Putin finally risked open war with Ukraine and ostracization from the West. This left everyone begging the question of why? What led Putin to risk everything by invading Ukraine? This is a collaboration video with fellow Youtuber Aditya Rathore, whose channel looks at geopolitics and current affairs. Together, we'll be trying to answer that question by looking at several factors we believe influenced his decision-making.
Слава нашим захисницям. Слава Україні.
An obvious place to start would be the geopolitical changes that occurred particularly in Central and Eastern Europe following the collapse of the Soviet Union. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, had been created to counter the very real threat of Soviet invasion, its easternmost border cut north-south across Germany for almost 4 decades. But with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the end of the Cold War, the organization remained and advanced steadily eastwards. Countries like Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states that had once been part of the Warsaw Pact started to join both the European Union and NATO. Starting in the Netherlands in the west, the European plain slowly widens as it rolls eastwards, where it stretches to be around 1,500 kilometers wide when it hits the border of modern-day Russia. Ukraine is a country of wide open fields, and despite several large rivers running north-south like the Dnipro and Dniester, it is a relatively easy avenue for attack. For centuries, Russian foreign policy had aimed to push as far west with conquest and buffer states as possible, to provide thousands of kilometers in which to stop invading forces from reaching the heartland of Russia in the west. When they did not manage to maintain this, Russia was invaded from the west by the Swedes, then the Poles, then the French, then the Germans, and now, it fears, by NATO. Directly to its west, Belarus is a firm Russian ally, and together with the Kaliningrad enclave, they can largely isolate the Baltic states. Unlike Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, Ukraine did not join NATO, but rather remained in limbo between it and the Russian CTSO alliance, a status quo acceptable to Moscow. However, this delicate balance was upset following the removal of pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych in the Maidan protests of 2014 over Ukraine's entrance to the European Union. Only several weeks later, unmarked Russian soldiers occupied the Crimean Peninsula and helped foment civil unrest and armed insurrection in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine. While the annexation of Crimea was extremely popular with Russian voters, it also doomed Putin's aspirations of keeping Ukraine as a Russian satellite state as it had been under the USSR. Votes for Kremlin-backed political parties dropped from around 40 to 50% to only 20%, and most of these from elderly people. Even heavily Russified cities such as Dnipro, where the vast majority of the population speaks Russian as a first language, became bastions of Ukrainian resistance against Russian aggression. While once language had divided Ukrainians, now both Ukrainian and Russian-speaking recruits fought shoulder to shoulder in both the regular army and various militia battalions against pro-Kremlin forces, despite efforts by such forces to politicize the issue of language. While pro-Russian rebels in Luhansk and Donetsk had declared republics independent of Ukraine, no other cities managed to break away following the chaos in 2014, and by the end of 2021, the war in the east had gone cold. Recent protests against the regimes of his allies in Belarus and Kazakhstan, as well as the growing popularity of internal rival Alexei Navalny, might have convinced Putin that decisive action, military action, was needed to rally the Russian people in support of his regime. Part of Putin's explanation for launching his special military operation was to demilitarize Ukraine, and he has since demanded of NATO that it return its forces and military infrastructure to its 1997 extent, that is, to the eastern border of Germany, in essence leaving Central and Eastern Europe as a kind of buffer zone.
Демилитаризации и денацификации Украины.
Нацистська партія йшла в Європу.
When Putin began his assault, he said that he is doing all of this for the denazification of Ukraine. But an article by Time magazine proves his theory to be wrong. Historians are even claiming that he is disconnected from the history around the Nazi regime of the 1930s and 1940s. Jason Stanley, a professor at Yale University, says the Soviet Union helped the Allies defeat the Nazis. There were more than 20 million casualties, and the memory of fighting still lives on in the Russian Empire. So using a term like denazification resonates deeply with his domestic audience, and it is a very powerful piece of propaganda. Moreover, Putin has been doing this for many years. He refers anything that comes from the West as Nazism. Additionally, Zelensky is also Jewish. His grandfather fought in the Soviet army against the Nazis, and his family lost relatives in the Holocaust. As a result, this denazification verse is more propaganda than proof and facts. The latest reports from the BBC suggest that Putin is aiming for a neutral Ukraine, and currently it appears Ukraine is no longer insisting on a NATO membership. In international law, neutrality refers to the state's commitment not to intervene in a military conflict of other states, whether by voluntary declaration or pressure. Switzerland is the best example of a neutral country. When Al Jazeera interviewed a few geopolitical experts, they said that neutrality could deliver peace. But there is some bad news too. Mark Galotti, an expert on Russian security operations, says a failure to strike a viable agreement could lead to a protracted war. Protracted war means a war that would last longer than expected, and don't get me wrong, the Syrian scenario in which the war continues for years is unlikely because of 3 points. Number one, the Western sanctions on Russia would erode its ability to maintain a military presence, which is already causing significant soldier losses and a daily financial cost estimated to be in tens of millions of dollars. Second point is that Putin would struggle to keep command over occupied areas in Ukraine where the people are still loyal to the Ukrainian flag. Third point is that Western economic and military assistance to the Russian army may boost Ukraine's resistance and make future Russian advancement much more difficult. So according to the current scenario, neutrality is the best possible path forward.
Говорил, что крушение Советского Союза было крупнейшей геополитической катастрофой века.
Various analysts have described Putin as anything from an old-school Russian nationalist to trying to reinstate a modern version of the Soviet Union. What is certain is that Putin wishes to return Russia to a period when it had been a great power, regionally as well as perhaps globally. This can be reflected in certain statements made by Putin. Russia had been a great power for centuries and remains so, and it has always had and still has legitimate zones of interest. We should not drop our guard in this respect, neither should we allow our opinion to be ignored. Putin also restored some symbols of the old Soviet regime, such as the national anthem and the five-pointed red star, as well as quasi-religious reverence of the Soviet triumph in World War II, known as the Great Patriotic War in Russian. In 2005, he described the collapse of the USSR as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. As for the Russian people, it became a genuine tragedy. Tens of millions of our fellow citizens and countrymen found themselves beyond the fringes of Russian territory. The Soviet Union had been a Russian-speaking empire, and it seems that Putin, through his speeches and tacit support for Russian speakers in Ukraine, may be trying to recreate an albeit smaller version of this empire. That isn't to say he wants to remodel the old USSR, as he has also embraced the Russian Orthodox Church, the religious basis for his belief that Ukrainians and Russians are the same people. He also blames Soviet leaders Lenin, Stalin, and Khrushchev for carving away Ukraine for political reasons, an error of history that he now needs to rectify. Just how much Putin himself believes this story, or whether this is a narrative being promulgated for the Russian and more ambitiously the Ukrainian public, is unclear. Putin frequently refers to Kiev as the mother of Russian cities, and erecting statues to honor Kievan Rus leaders Vladimir the Great, who had ruled from Kiev. All the while, the Ukrainian government in that very city was drifting ever further away following the Euromaidan protests. In 2015, new decommunization laws accelerated the removal of Soviet symbols from public spaces. Statues of Lenin in Kyiv and the renaming of towns, cities, streets and squares across the country, as well as the reinforcement of the Ukrainian language as opposed to Russian, showed the direction in which this Ukrainian government was moving. With every passing year, Ukraine was slipping further away from being Little Russia and closer to fully embracing Western organizations.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
To explain why he is starting a war, we need to understand the mindset and experiences of Putin, and his time as a KGB officer is quite important. Many of his techniques, such as using Russian-backed separatists to carry out his war in eastern Ukraine and forming a puppet government in Crimea, are vintage KGB tactics from the Soviet era. And during the KGB days, there was one major incident that changed the life of the Russian president upside down. Fiona Hill, a former officer at the US National Security Council, in her research claims that the 1980s was a time of hope and excitement for many Russians because of the greater political and social freedoms implemented by the last Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. It created an atmosphere of open criticism, so Russians were happy as they got a taste of freedom. But Putin, on the other hand, wasted that wonderful moment because he was in East Germany working for the KGB, where he witnessed the fall of the Berlin Wall. So while the Russians were having the best time, Putin was irritated and furious. And to make things worse, the news of the end of Cold War flooded the television screens. Putin and his KGB buddies were fearing for their lives and career. Former Soviet colonies quickly destroyed all of their documents and placed calls to Moscow that went unanswered. For KGB operatives like the young Putin, this was not a time for celebration, but rather a lesson in nature. Putin, like his role model, Soviet diplomat to Hungary, Yuri Andropov, came to the judgment that openness is dangerous, protesting is dangerous, talking about democracy and political reform is risky. Moreover, markets can be completely open, elections can be completely unpredictable, and opposition must be appropriately managed. And all of these lessons that Putin learned back in the 1980s can be seen in his leadership style even to this date. And we have several examples, such as interfering in businesses, censoring opponents, crushing those who do not share his ideas, and so on. Putin believes in the centralization of power. He controls so many levels of the Russian society and economy. Just try to imagine an American president who controlled not only the executive branch, including the FBI, CIA, NSA, but also Congress and even the judiciary, as well as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and all other major businesses including Apple, Google, etc. And all of you might not be familiar with the fact that Ukraine was the Soviet Union's second most populous and richest republic, as well had the greatest cultural ties with Russia. But the situation in 2014 was alarming for Moscow. Young Ukrainians, like the Russian opposition, were singing anti-corruption songs and waving European Union flags. These protesters were motivated by the same ideals that Putin hates at home and seeks to overthrow internationally. The ideals are the basic rights and freedoms given in a democracy, like freedom of speech and right to protest. And so Putin's following invasion of Crimea punished Ukrainians for attempting to flee the autocratic system that he wanted them to live in. It also showed Putin's own people in Russia that political transformation comes at a terrible cost.
Alright everyone, that is the end of today's video. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Aditya for suggesting making this video together and taking the time to make his own video that I have now spliced into this one. Let me know in the comments below, do you think that we've hit every point as to why Putin personally wants to take over Ukraine, or indeed to conduct what he calls his special military operation in Ukraine, or have there been things that we've missed? Let us know in the comments below, as I'd be really curious to hear hear your thoughts on the topic. As ever, thank you very much for watching. Check out Aditya's channel, which will be linked in the description below. And until next time, I've been Hilbert, and this has been The History.